So welcome to our third installment of Work, Sex, Money, real life on the path of mindfulness. And we're presently at the 6th chapter, the nowness of work. So, you know what my teachers always, since somebody's reminding me of Shichen, and I think as many of you always probably do anyway, but when we begin any study, it's important to recognize the relevance in what we're doing for all sentient beings. So our study is intended to translate into a process of transformation, and this transformation we undertake with the intention to benefit all sentient beings. So this we call preparing with bodhicitta. So this we should always have when we're beginning any study. So so kindly generate this motivation as we now begin. And I should once again emphasize that my intention with these sessions is that you study the book, and I'm only, you could say, doing a very rough job in terms of summarizing. So please keep that in mind, and please refer to the book. Okay. Trungpa Rinpoche says the spiritual search should be aimless, otherwise it ceases to be spirituality, because spirituality is limitless. And for that matter, this applies to anything in life, end of quote. So when we speak about aimlessness, it's from the point of view that enlightenment and what we're attempting here is something that is breaking away from the habitual patterns that keep us in a cycle of suffering. So, and what is the good news is that the ego and the antics, the habitual patterns of the ego, is actually ultimately illusional. It's just like a dream. We don't gradually come out of a dream, and we just wake up. And similarly also with everything that we that we feel are so deeply entrenched in us, our dear self and everything that comes with it. We tend to, the nature of samsara is that ego manages somehow to fool us into believing that it's real and that there's something happening. We're always doing something. That's one of the ways that ego perpetuates itself, that it's always doing something, has something going, it's onto something. We're always somewhere. So as we're practicing, we can say we have enlightenment as a goal, but then again, we are about identifying enlightenment as the innate nature of reality. And so that reality we touch on through letting go of going somewhere else. So we practice being present. This is, of course, the theme of this chapter. And Trungpa Rinpoche, he talks about the ways that we're always sort of onto something else. Now, to not be onto something else doesn't mean that we're becoming passive. It's more that we're understanding what it is that we're doing, what's the real nature of the path. So when we're sitting down and not doing anything, we are doing a lot. And when we are identifying the value of nowness, it's not that we are becoming inefficient. But, and you could say the Bodhisattva path, of course, operates with notions of paths and so on. There's a goal to be attained, enlightenment, but all of this is, strangely enough, running contrary to the logic of ego. And that is where we appreciate this nature of the path as being aimless. So The Bodhisattva vision is one of dedication to others and to immensity. Once you take the implication of saving all others literally, you lose the sacredness of the Bodhisattva vow. Trungpa Rinpoche, he very often quotes a great Tibetan, actually rebel, or at least iconoclast, a free thinker, a great Lama and a great master of Buddhism called Gendun Chimpa, who would say, if you follow the Mahayana, you better get used to the concept of inconceivability. And the view and application of the Bodhisattva path, it is not on the premise of ego's self-centering. So that means the Bodhisattva, as we're practicing the path, our path is on the premise of others. And so we have this scope where we let go of just the narrowness of ourselves and embrace all sentient beings. So this vision is vast, and it's of course way beyond anything that we are familiar with, but it also goes beyond, you could say, a slightly square sense of numbers and time. This immensity lies beyond the scope of what we could call objectification. See, if we're thinking of all sentient beings, that we have to save all sentient beings, that of course is excellent. But if we get too literal and think of it in terms of time and space, and there's me doing this for someone, then we're getting overly literal. And Trungpa Rinpoche tells a story about the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who, after having saved countless sentient beings, saw that they were still there, even more, and so on. And he began to have some doubt about what he was doing. And according to his vow, which was, he had a Bodhisattva vow which said, if I ever have doubt on the nature of my path, that my head split open, if I ever have hesitation. And as a result, then his head split wide open. But the Buddha Amitabha, he came and he taught that he taught Avalokiteshvara that he was taking his vow too literal, and that ultimately what we mean with compassion goes beyond the notion, this ultimately self-centered notion that's me doing something for others. And that this literal understanding of me doing something for others is way too narrow for what we're doing here. It is ultimately beyond time and space, ultimately about immensity. So, as far as attaining enlightenment, Trungpa Rinpoche also says you don't try to attain enlightenment at all, but you find yourself enlightened at a certain stage because you continually put in such a concentrated effort. And Trungpa Rinpoche comments, there are no part-time bodhisattvas. This is, you could say, complete dedication, but also without any sense of going somewhere. So only when we go somewhere or have to complete something, then we need a break, right? Awareness of the pervasiveness of now provides honesty and realism. With now, work is ever careless. Precision comes from now. So, as bodhisattvas, we're committed to being here fully. When we listen to music, we're not waiting for what comes next or lingering on the music that we just heard. Now is always with us. It's choiceless. It's our anchor. It's the basis of our perceptions of the past and our thoughts about the future. Actually, we have a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who actually said a lot of interesting things about how in our reality is really just a conception of reality based on what exists in the past. Anyway, so yet the now itself is not tied down by conceptions, and our ability to be awake in the present is what determines the value and wisdom of the choices we make. So we might think we're deliberating about what comes next, but in fact the best deliberations and the best choices we make is when we're properly present. Trungpa Rinpoche says, the minute when you begin to speculate, that moment is past already. You perceive now rather than think of it. Now can only be perceived. rather than thought of. So I'd like to say this is something that's very helpful for the practice of meditation, just what Trungpa Rinpoche is saying. So please have a look at that and sort of have that as something that you could say, refer to in terms of your meditation practice. I personally find it very helpful. We have various difficult approaches to work. We could be careful, or we could communicate. Yet we could relax. We could have a sense of humor and enjoy the basic delight of the situation. So we're always trying to do the right thing. We have such problematic attitudes to work. We're impulsive, we can end up being resentful, we doubt its worth. And then we might quit our job. We start another job, and then the whole thing repeats. It might be about being open to the reality of where we are and beginning to be there, present, without being resentful. Then we could also try to be communicative, and we could try to push ourselves into being present. It could be a bit awkward, and there could be some games and so on. But then again, we might have less paranoia, and then gradually we might find our way to be comfortable in our work. We could be fearful, we could begin to have some confidence identification with the corporation, and this of course is something that is used a lot in modern management, sort of identifying with your corporation. But ultimately, this is really about us it's not just about us finding some gimmick that enables us to handle our situation. It's actually, again, coming back to being willing to be completely present in the now, completely not going anywhere, not wanting something, willing to engage in full communication. So that means that we might have disagreements, it might not be smooth, but we communicate and we drop our sort of self-consciousness, and we, rather than having an objective, we develop a sense of humor, some aerial perspective, joy in the situation. So that's where something like work is so useful for us to identify what's happening with us in terms of our path. Trungpa Rinpoche says the challenge is how to have actual communication with others and with the situation as a whole. So what we mean here as Buddhists is that discipline is to wholeheartedly get into the situations. We don't think of discipline as like if I was at home and meditating, I had discipline. Here, discipline actually means that we engage. And this is where Trungpa Rinpoche goes quite into some detail. And we might think, hey, he's a monk. What does he know? And the thing is, someone like Trungpa Rinpoche actually has run a corporation as an abbot. So he talks from a lot of sort of experience in terms of work and commitment, responsibility, and so on. Workplace dynamics, politics. He's been in the middle of that from a very early age. But also that being tempered with, you could say, permeated by guidance and wisdom, and him being enabled to see a lot of things that we might not notice. So this is about meditation in action. A healthy interplay with the environment is self-enlightening. We need to encourage wholeheartedly, through the discipline of work process. Sorry, there's a typo there. We need to let go of reservations about what we're doing. So we mentioned earlier that we are karmically linked to what we're doing, and engaging is about being drawn unreservedly into where we're working. So this is what we mean with discipline. If we don't do that, we're going to miss out. Such engagement requires an aerial perspective. Humor allows for a personal style that also delights in others' style. So when we talk about vipassana, wider perspective, this is where we begin to disassociate with the, you could say, grip that our self-centered narratives have on us. We cease to ruminate and strategize and manipulate, and we more appreciate what is happening and see the wisdom of what's happening unfolding It might be difficult, there might be challenges for us, it might be an entirely painful or unwanted situation, but it doesn't help that we begin to get bogged down in our attachment and aversion strategies and so on. We do need to see things from above. And that also could allow for us beginning to have some confidence in who we are and some feeling sort of joy. And that, of course, situations might be difficult, but that confidence give an inner sense of buoyancy, that we actually float above it all. And we also begin to appreciate the style of others. And that also has to do with when we're engaging in the path, our appreciation for the Sangha. Again, it could be our Sangha, it could also be those we work with. Chapter 7, Creativity and Chaos. So creativity is the key to work, and it comes from being connected. Such connectedness comes from presence and openness. So us being creative doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to sit down and figure it all out, and we do that on our own. It really just comes from us being present, wholeheartedly engaged. And this, of course, is what we're training in. Everything here is the path to enlightenment, but again, workplace context provides a brilliant mirror for what we're going through. So the previous discussion on presence, wholeheartedness, connectedness, sense of humor, it's about relating to where we are. So we want to cultivate that, underlying that is the foundation of our ability to, let's say, perform or be creative with whatever work we're doing. It has a lot to do with being where we are and having unparanoid, open exchanges with others as well. Now, ambitions make you lose that perspective and connection to the real meaning. Routine work is part of the whole. It can be an art. Some years ago, there was an interview with, did I mention it? Trungpa Rinpoche, who was encouraging people to get, don't just follow their higher ideals in terms of meaningful work, but actually do things that were practical, becoming electricians and plumbers and so on. And that is where sometimes if we have sort of refined ideas of what we're going to do with our lives, we might miss the point. That kind of ambition could bring us down. We're not saying that we shouldn't dream or that we shouldn't be imaginative, creative, but if it's ambition, that's different. Then we're driven out of insecurity. And we would rather want to cultivate an awareness of what is required. So ambition is something that results in losing a certain overview, and we can actually lose ourselves. We can lose our head. Without this tunnel vision of ambition, we should be able to accept routine jobs as well. We very often think we were meant for something higher, but we very often can be perfectly fine with just simple jobs. Ambition or pride may stand for a fall, like the Tibetan landlord who lost his head. That's a funny story where he couldn't, the Tibetan landlord who didn't get the morning sun, so he had all his workers out there sort of removing the top of the mountain. They figured that was a lot of work. It's much easier just to remove the head of the landlord, and they had less effort. So that is a proverb that teaches us, shows us that things work smoother without this kind of pig-headed ambition. Personally, I've done a lot of janitoring. I like to say that I'm really a janitor and just posing as some sort of Buddhist instructor. And this is because when I went to India, I of course came back. I was not in Denmark that long, so I would never really. I mean, obviously, a career was not in the cards, and so I would just make money as best I could while I was staying with my parents. But sometimes for a few months at a time. And that kind of labor, just washing floors, is I wouldn't say I was doing it according to the, as an art or even as it should be done, but it was certainly never, you could say, it never felt meaningless. There was always the possibility of doing it properly and engaging properly with what one was doing. So, so that is definitely something that's possible, but of course, I remember working in hospitals cleaning there, and you're definitely the bottom of the hierarchy there. But so what? Good for your pride. So Trungpa Rinpoche talks about we need to dismiss this snobbishness that wishes higher positions. So without this kind of acceptance, without we having people who take these jobs, then our culture would be divided into those who have the jobs they want and those that didn't get the jobs. So we have humans and subhumans. So many great masters have taken routine work and flourished. For example, the sixth patriarch, Huineng, famously worked as a cook for many years. He even worked as a cook for some hunters. And you also had Trungpa Rinpoche talks about how some of the great masters in work camps under communist Chinese, even though they didn't have any credentials, just because they were good and wholehearted in what they're doing, these great meditators, these great masters, naturally just became very useful, just on a very practical level, and became, leaders of work gangs. Working with people is a big advantage, and the attitude about work is what makes a difference. So with people, when we do have the possibility of working with people, we do have that possibility of appreciating who they are. But of course, we could also have that with mechanical work. So Trungpa Rinpoche encourages us to find ways to work with these circumstances, turn them into the path, rather than resent. And when people have some sense of freedom within the work, then maybe they're even sort of thinking, "Oh, it's going to be over soon." If they have a different perspective, it changes how they engage with it. So it's not really about the work in itself. We have to be clear on that. It's about the way that we accept. So you have monasteries. They offer simple lifestyle. Some might feel trapped in a monastery. Some might feel comfort. Some might feel it affords inspiration. So again, it comes down to attitude, not so much about a supposedly meditative approach. So the ideal situation of a regular monastic living we might imagine that it can be very inspiring, but you could very well have persons who think a monastic situation is claustrophobic. So it really depends how we view it and how, once we're in there, how we relate to the potential for communication, creativity, and all of that, again, is not just worldly, secular, unimportant things. These are the outer aspects of meditation and action. Negativity might occur when we had expected peace. This is our opportunity. Such negativity cannot be intellectually classified as helpful. We need to feel it completely. This is important. So we very often stumble into the unwanted, right? So of course, as a practitioner, we're not exactly sort of heading towards being confirmed and all the comforts and so on. And when we might appreciate that we will have chaos and things are difficult. In fact, that might actually, you could say, the degree to which we aspire, we might actually be blessed with chaotic circumstances. Now, that is part of the journey. These are opportunities, and they require intelligent patience, not naivete. So that's where we sometimes have these kind of cliches, fridge magnets and the like. They will tell us about, all these kind of unwanted things. They are just their blessing and all of that, which we're saying here. But it's so much about us actually living that. So that's where there's a big difference between just the Dharma as a cliche and being a practitioner. And controlling is controlling the negativity through some sort of positive attitude still comes with the agenda of self. And it's, in fact, not what really helps us become truly confident practitioners. So we need to just simply, without commentary, go along with what is happening, and then we relate fully to the energy, the reality of the situation. We, of course, try to solve it if we can. But there is a sense of not resenting what is happening. To know what is right and wrong, what to reject and what to accept, we need a view of the complete picture. We can then act with the full awareness of the situation, choicelessly, without judgment. So that kind of simplicity applies. If we buy something, we first need to ascertain what it is. And if not, then we might just be imagining that, we see something and we just go in there. We don't really properly see where it is we're going. And in that sense, we want to be discerning about a particular situation. It's not that we are saying things ought to be in a particular way, but situations might just have their own logic, and we need to be sensitive to that. We need to sit in it. Again, we're not talking about something that's destined. And so it becomes quite simple what it is, what course of action we need to take. So we will know what works and what doesn't. But all of that doesn't come from our sort of imposing some philosophy or anything. It just comes from being properly present with what is. We need to get over snobbishness. So as far as our work goes, we might not get what we had expected, but then we need to be there with what is. And it doesn't help us, obviously, to resent not having what we would have liked. So in Tibet, there was a practice of giving sometimes learned and refined people menial chores to help them get over their arrogance. This, of course, is if you have a great Vajrayana guru and so on. It's not mean. And these people, they might have been, had some role and some status. And Trungpa Rinpoche says it would have been so easy for them to just say, okay, you do 100 prostrations in the temple. But actually being then the tea server or the sweeper and so on, that actually is something that helps getting over arrogance. And of course it works particularly then in an Asian context where there's so much concern about saving face. Personally, I remember living in Tashijong, a Drukpa Kagyu community. And in there, they had these great yogis called the Togdens, the realized ones, who have long hair, who dress in white, and have done many, many years and even decades of practice. But before anyone can engage in that kind of training of becoming a Togden, you actually have to serve in the kitchen just for a few years. And so that's where we clearly need to get over some sort of hierarchical and ambitious way of viewing the way that we engage with work. There's also a sort of laziness that can prevent us from getting involved. We might lack real discipline, and then drifting, we wait for something worthy of our talent. Breaking the conceptual barrier to open communication, work becomes open and creative. So we might be inspired, but then give up when a work requires application and routine. We lack discipline. We might feel that we're destined for something higher. In reality, we drift. We're thinking that we're going to eventually stumble upon something that is intended for us. Trungpa Rinpoche points to how rulers in Asia were often trained in numerous ordinary skills, including martial arts, blacksmith work, And that kind of all-rounding is essential, really, that we're not just going to be sitting on a throne, we're not just going to be CEOs, but we actually want to start from the bottom. So what we have in such a person in terms of ruler with confidence is a dignity that is not based on pride. It's a bit different nowadays when we have this classroom learning situation and persons being alien to the actual application of the particular field that they're studying. But that is where being on the spot, it can awaken then this common sense. We might change a tire, we might start a fire, and we might accept some challenge where we might necessarily not have studied previously. So it's not as if we're predestined to just do very few things. Trungpa Rinpoche says, if a person is able to reach the point of breaking the conceptual barrier to open communication, his or her work becomes open and creative. That possibility is always there. There are hidden qualities in us, always. So we're at the halfway mark, and I'll just see if there are any questions. Oh, there are. Great. In the nowness of work, when we get insecure, anxious, or get over fixation on tasks, and it stands... in the nowness of work, when we get insecure, anxious, or get overly fixated on tasks, and this fixation stands in the way for creativity and spaciousness, how do we work with that nowness? We just notice it and become aware? Yeah, that is actually what we do. We, however, do not presume that this ability to just notice is that easy, and hence we do something in Buddhism always, and I think everyone knows that, and everyone knows what it is, and it's meditation. It's a bit like martial arts. We can't just learn the technique of martial arts without actually training. So this practice of not doing anything and training ourselves in nowness through the practice of meditation is essential for us to then successfully translate that into our everyday life. But once we're a little bit onto that, then the irritations and the humbling shortcomings of our abilities, then they become part of the journey. And this is, you could say, at that point, we might have all these insecurities and fixations, but we also know that it's workable. While reading this chapter, the thought entered my head that maybe I'd like to, or should, swap my job in a creative field, which I do enjoy, for a routine job, so I can practice more effectively. Do you think this is just work materialism and I should focus my energy more on nowness within my current job? I have to say yes. We probably, there's, the grass is pretty green where we are, and sure, we could, the communists, they experimented with this, sending all the intellectuals out into the fields and so on. And to some extent, I think actually life affords that. We might be very, you could say, cerebral or engaged with abstract work and so on, but, there's constantly the kitchen sink. There's the bathroom, there's the vacuuming under the beds. There's attention to all the aspects of our current jobs. So I think we might want to just reinvent ourselves within our present situation. In terms of making decisions, have you heard any advice from Vijayadhara Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche or any of your teachers on this? Often it's very difficult for me to make decisions, and the feeling of the right choice is often left unclear, and is unclear for long periods of time. Yes, this is slightly external to the topic here, but if you're a Vajrayana practitioner and you have a connection with a teacher, you can very often rely on just thinking, what would my teacher do in these circumstances? And sometimes the answer that comes is not necessarily what we'd want. we actually know ourselves that we might have to sort of shed our comfort zone and so on. So that's, you could say, a Vajrayana approach, and Guru Yoga, mingling mind with the teacher and so on. This is what I remember some of my teachers spoke of. And then also through the practice of meditation, shamatha, settling the mind, that helps. That's the best I can do. And of course, the nature of the path, it's not so that we just all of a sudden it's all fixed. But anyway, these are my sort of, how do you say, my proposals for handling that. Okay, we'll do chapter 8 then. Communication. An enlightened or confused state of mind depends on being alienated or not. It comes from relinquishing a secure dwelling place, not about exotic practices. Trungpa Rinpoche says, to review, basically, spiritual practice is dealing with our psychological state of being. The difference between the enlightened and the confused state of mind depends on whether you see situations as they are, or you fail to see them as they are and are confused or frightened by them. Excuse me just a second. So, again, with the path to enlightenment, we're not going somewhere else. Awakening, Trungpa is onto, is about seeing the universe clearly. It comes from relinquishing a need for a secure dwelling place, comfort zone, cocoon. So true spirituality is about going beyond this need for such an objective or an aim and so on. It's not that we're going to go and do years of practice and then we've done that and everything's good. Trungpa Rinpoche talks about you might come out from your 10-year retreat and you haven't actually transformed, you just did that. So it's really about the present reality. It's not about the retreats that we're going to do in the future or that we claim to have done and so on. So this applies to all aspects of the path. And tantric path, indeed, it might involve these accumulations of repetitions. Yet when you complete them, you might have done all these things and you still are the same. So in a way, credentials are conceptual. And sometimes, having done this or that, it really just becomes sort of a heroism. And it doesn't actually do much. So it's so much about there being proper substance. So spirituality needs to be discussed in terms of our ordinary world. You don't need to cling to a concept about who you are or who you will be. So hence, here we are studying a book about work, sex, and money. And that is really, you could say, as we see here, what reflects our spiritual path. So the spiritual is not something external to us. It is something that is understood in terms of our ordinary experiences. So this is where we find then the jewel in the rubbish heap. Trungpa Rinpoche says, you are now, you're not past, you're not future, but you are now. In that state of awareness, you don't need to cling to a concept about who you are or who you will be. The real way of being without aim is dealing with the completely present situation. If we do have an aim, it has to be based on our full relationship with the present. So We can afford to be present as we are. We don't need to be improved. We don't need to have special qualifications, credentials. We don't need to have any ideas about who we are or who we might be. We interact. We can be real and we can build on this present moment as we go along. So being out of touch, then, that can be disastrous, as we're not actually experiencing what's happening. We can have a goal or an aim, but we then have to be grounded in the present. So we're going somewhere, but we're going one step at a time. We're going from where we are. Like Pema Chodron says, start where you are. So that's very important. Our problems become a source of inspiration. Here, we let go of our comfortable nest. So what's referred to here is that our work can become a source of our inspiration. Nothing is rejected as ordinary. Nothing is humdrum. Nothing is also, we don't need to sort of start imagining that, the sort of, that we are sort of sitting up on cloud 9 or anything. We're not trying to imagine something about some sacred quality. It's really just the wholehearted relationship that constitute this experience of work as sacred. So that's where we don't have a strategy about exclusion and inclusion, what we can accept and not. We're willing to throw ourselves fully into and completely letting go of our cocoon, our comfort zone. We might think, or others might tell us, that we need to be proud. This, of course, has a lot to do with, you could say, folk wisdom about, pride in what you're doing. But that's fine. But what we're talking about here is just being comfortable where we are and making friends with ourselves. And that friendship and that confidence is not based on these credentials of, being a master of this or that. Just being a master of something is quite inconsequential. It's more that we engaged in that process. And that's where it's not about the credentials, but about the one who engaged and did this. So we certainly don't need the familiar games of competition or of credentials. When it comes to sex, the essence of sex is often lost when it is part of an economy of debt. Trungpa Rinpoche says we're expected to be faithful and committed to our spouses and lovers. This seems to be based on a sense of debt. It is the quintessence in our exchange. It is expressed with the body, but the essence that is behind is what counts. So when we're engaging in sex, it's actually the place where we're engaging with the other in a way that we normally never engage. And so there is this sense that there is an immense openness. But then when this openness becomes objectified and we say, oh, I'm in love, and it's with you that I'm in love, then we're objectifying the other. And when we objectify the other, then it becomes, the ego's agenda is, okay, I'm loving you. Are you loving me back? And that's where it then becomes an economy. And that's where the essence of the relationship or the essence of the exchange is lost, because there's some sense of economy, giving, taking, and all of that. And that brings the sense of obligation. So as such, then, we can see sex as something where we're coming close, and it's also an expression of surrender and commitment. So sex can take place on many levels, more or less subtle. Bindu is the currency that drives the communication or sexual economy. So this is interesting, where sex is not just about you could say, the sexual act as we understand it, but it can be also about something more subtle. And we sometimes talk about the various ages. In Indian cosmology, we talk about 4 ages, and also in the context of what we call samadhis, the 4 samadhis, we talk about increasingly subtle ways of interaction. So the gods on the samadhis have increasingly subtle ways of consummating the relationship. So we, on our growth in the realm of desire and so on, we have then the ordinary sex that we are familiar with. But in some realms, then it's more about just holding hands, and on the higher level, just smiling to each other, and finally just looking. So they're increasingly, these are metaphors, you could say, of how our communication can be more or less subtle. It doesn't have to be that physical aspect. So when we have Bindu, that very often is seen as the essence of consciousness in our physical body, and it has that element of libido. It's a great force in our life, and it is very much what drives us towards the other. It can be something that opens up where we normally would be reluctant to go. Conservative administration is residing within bodily and vital completion, or brahmacharya. Brahmacharya can be miserly or excessive, undermining the sacredness of sexual communication. So when we talk about brahmacharya, we sometimes think of this as just being celibate or retaining essence and so on, but it's a bit more than that. It's more about what is meant literally by brahmacharya is residing in completeness. Brahma as completeness and charya as holding or abiding in that. And that also means not getting lost in the other. So that means that you could say, don't completely become dependent on the other. And that could be non-dual bliss, but it could also be a part of some sort of strategy. So it can become tight and it can become loose. And we can become Bindu materialists, holding ourselves back in, you can say, various ways. So we're not just talking, you could say, the physical aspect, but also about the way that we give ourselves in a relationship, in a sexual relationship, or in a sort of more subtle aspect of relationship. Anyway, in the case of excess, overly letting go, it could become frivolous abuse, and that brings on some sort of handing ourselves over to the other, and also struggling with ourselves. So it creates a difficult situation that undermines then the sacredness of sexual communication. And then sex can become cheap. People can end up using each other. True and sacred communication may express itself in sex. Food can also be sacred. Dressing can be sacred. The sacred is a matter of respect, which has to be prepared. The sort of discussion that we're having here is somewhat prompted by this taking place in the 70s, where there was a very different attitude in popular discourse around sex. Nowadays, it's of course, we have Me Too. We have a lot of political correctness around sex and so on, where the 70s was more coming at the end of the sexual revolution. And so there's, you could say, some contextual parameters that we need to be aware of here. But anyway, in that, it still applies. And what we're talking here is communication that's beyond words. And that's where we think about sex as a sacred dimension. It could be physical sex. It could be more subtle, like we had in this example of the gods touching, smiling, looking. But this is really just a way that we are communicating or just relating with the object. So we could have, we very often think of Tantra, quote unquote, as we have it in California or in Byron Bay, is something to do with sex. But actually, Tantra also could be about eating or dressing, just ways that we interact with objects, pleasure, and so on. Trungpa says defecating can even be an offering. Anything that has to do with life can be sacred, but it doesn't have to be a ritual. If we sort of start to ritualize it, then again it becomes something that could be that lose its sacred quality. And that's where the absence of frivolity has a lot to do with awareness, preparation, attention, and so on. And we lose the sacredness when we have that frivolity, essentially being mindless. Using sex for self-conscious spirituality is another double cross of the ego. Genuine joy of orgasm takes you beyond concepts. So if we begin to sort of put some trip on sex or on communication, it becomes less real. It loses the simplicity, genuineness, and it begins to play into then the games and the insecurity of ego. And that's where you're no longer actually there. You're manipulating. So sacredness is when there's no selfishness involved. It's pure action without a watcher, in its proper application. Such joy then is in the Tantras is described as occurring in 4 moments, and it includes the experience of orgasm and consists of 4 increasing degrees of subtlety and joy. And where the ultimate, of course, is beyond conventional notion of joy. The Tibetan term is actually even gadra, it means free from joy, but it's just beyond any kind of conventional sense of being pleasant to the ego or to our expectations. But all of these degrees of joy, they actually imply more and more genuine communication, and that you could say is where sex can provide some sacred insight, or insight into the sacred. Tantra is about the two-ness or the union of the feminine and masculine. So there's a non-duality which is created through the bliss of interacting with other. So there's always an object, and there's someone who is getting into someone, or someone receiving someone. In Tantra Vajrayana, we use this metaphor a lot. The masculine and feminine principle, we say appearance and emptiness, awareness and space, phenomena and consciousness, and so on. Again, what we've alluded to earlier, sexual communication doesn't need to be physical. It can be ultimate friendship. Openness can be lost through insecurity. So when we have openness, there's trust, there is the joy of the other, and that is where there's no longer the neurosis about handling the other. There's trust, and that's where we have then the bliss of non-duality. And that's where there's natural faithfulness. That's not about going here or going there. And it's just about attraction being drawn. And it might not be consummated necessarily, but it is about trust and attraction that brings joy. And that kind of trust and openness, they can be threatened then by the insecurity, which is then where we begin to say, I'm having fun. I'm enjoying this. And that is where you could say the habitual attachment to pleasure then trips us up. And hence it should be said also within the tantric tradition, there's so much emphasis on the dangers of this kind of practice. Very often the tantric practitioners, they operate with the imagery of the abhyom and the whole understanding of attraction and interaction with the object and also sexual libido and so on, without necessarily acting on it, but really just savoring it, experiencing it fully. And it doesn't necessarily involve the act. So you could have monks that are tantrikas. Some yogis might scoff at them and say they lack experience, but according to the tantras and on the premises of the tantras themselves, then definitely this is not something that requires ordinary physical sex, but is about the bliss of non-duality between the perceiver and the perceived, subject and object. Love-hate happens once we have the ego's game of doubt and bewilderment, and that's where you could say that's what gets in the way when we're in love. So once we objectify the relationship from the point of view of ego, then we have doubt, bewilderment, and the relationship turns from attraction into aggression. We go from identifying and clinging to closeness to clinging to distance. So there before we were like, oh, we're so close. And then we go, oh, there's this gap, this distance. So physical attraction can turn to physical aggression. Love can become hate. One disciple who developed his ego rather than wisdom got annoyed with his teacher. His devotion turned into hatred and he killed him. That's actually the famous story of Rudra. The teacher told the student, just be natural. And the student, he had two students. One just settled into wisdom and was liberated. And the other followed ego. And following ego followed all his desires and all his hatred and became a terrible person. And then coming back to his meeting his old friend, the other student, who was then liberated through just settling into naturalness, the student who was just following his habitual patterns became really outraged that should be the way, and so they disagreed on what was the path and what was the nature of the instruction. They went to the teacher. Teacher said to one, "You're right," to the other, "You're wrong," and the one who was wrong then killed the teacher on the spot. And it said that he went through 500 rebirths as terrible, painful existences, and finally he was reborn in one of the god realms as this three-headed, four-legged, six-armed personification of complete egohood. And that's where the teacher and the student from previous life, then out of compassion, they overcame him. There's some details to this, but anyway, they overcame and taught him, you could say, transformed his outlook, and at that point then he offered his body as a vehicle of enlightenment. And that's actually how we trace, this is the genesis for the form of the wrathful deities, particularly then in the Nyingma we refer to all the 8 herukas of the Mahayoga sections, but I think this story also applies in the new translations. Anyway, that was a bit of a diversion, but anyway, this is you could say where ego, where you could say wisdom of settling into the natural state and just being natural is very different from when we're giving into ego. And similar also in the case of sex, the openness can be lost and instead it can be turned into the agenda of ego when we have a sort of a frivolous take on sex, on relationships. In love, we naturally give, yet we might notice that and then resent our giving. We cease to be open and want something. Things get difficult. The cure is generosity without expectation. So we're giving and then we think, I'm giving, and we begin to have this doubt. The other should be giving back. That's where this economy occurs. So that brings resistance from the other to notices that you've ceased giving. And then the opening and the giving becomes more and more difficult. So the cure is giving without expectation, generosity without expectation. We might say, but then I'm just giving and the other's not giving. We actually inspire the others. We should try it out. It works. We can't be perfect lovers, but we could see the profundity of sex and communication. We could see how the dynamics and attitudes of our spirituality and meditation is reflected. So we understand the profound nature of sex and communication. And this provides an avenue for us beginning to understand what it is to be open, what it is to let go of self, and the discipline then of egolessness. And this in turn can inspire the purpose and the motivation for practicing meditation. We could let go of ourselves and embrace that. The yogi's liberation comes from letting go of any familiar reference points. So when we practice shamatha, we might arrive at some sense of shikantaze, or not having any goal or aim, and this might give us some sense of well-being, but then we're still fixating on our calm, and we still have a notion as me as opposed to other, this as opposed to that. So we need to let go of that, have greater spaciousness. It's not about ego or here, but it's about us actually being fearless in interacting with that, the other. So the yogi could hold back, but that is dangerous. The yogi lets go and attains freedom. Letting go of reference point is even letting go of awareness, of egolessness. So the watcher is lost, and we proceed into relating fully to the other, to space. So initially we watch in our meditation, but then we're so involved with reality, space, and the other that the insecurity of ego or holding back doesn't apply. So this sounds very mystical, but this is in fact what we sometimes might experience in sex, in relationships, and also just in life in general, but where we are no longer holding back or half-hearted. Also, this is of course what applied in the previous discussion on work. So the watcher doesn't really, this self-consciousness doesn't have any function anymore. So eventually there is this exhausting of the need for reassurance, credentials, criteria, and so on. So we're entering into that, or space, but we're not worried because the whole journey is not owned by the ordinary insecure ego. Passion as a path is dangerous, yet we can't ignore it in our relationship to the other. It is highly intelligent and has great potential. So it's famous that this kind of path is treacherous. Like Longchenpa says, many a great yogin has been ambushed on the path of what we call the third empowerment, taking desire as the path. But many of us are in relationships, and many of us are lay people. We might be in various forms of relationships, and even if we're not, we're still interacting with the other. And so this interaction of various kinds is something that sparks off a great intelligence, insight. And this is, like we saw before, something that can inform our motivation for practice and also the potential for realization. So it might be dangerous, but then again, we could probably afford to consider this and listen to the messages that is coming in from there. See if there's any questions. The faces of our lineage sages seem to have this smileless smile and very penetrating yet soft gaze of joy, love. Am I imagining this? You might be right. You could say it's the smile of unconditional joy. And so it's not like the sort of like the cat that just ate the canary smile. I got what I wanted, the sort of hedonist smile. But it is very much the savoring of reality. So yes, we have faces of the lineage sages sometimes like that. Yes, I mean we usually paint them like that, and also deities, the peaceful deities, and so on. Then again, the wrathful deities, they might manifest externally this sort of wrathful aspect, but in fact also their heart possesses that same smile. Sometimes to sort of accentuate that, we visualize a peaceful deity in the heart of the wrathful deity. Yeah. So, thank you very much for participating in this week's study. And for the next time, please read Chapter 9, The Flame of Love, Chapter 10, Pure Passion, and Chapter 11, Family Karma. Thank you very much. Good night. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed.